Welcome to the Self-Brain Surgery Podcast, where neuroscience meets faith to bring real, measurable change to your life. I'm Dr. Lee Warren, board-certified neurosurgeon and author. On this show, we explore cutting-edge brain science, mental resilience, and how faith and mindset work together to shape your health and your happiness. If you're ready to take control of your thoughts and rewire your brain for hope, you're in the right place. Real change isn't easy, but it's always worth it. Remember, you can't change your life until you change your mind. Let's get after it. Good morning, my friend. I'm Dr. Lee Warren, and I'm so grateful and excited to be back with you for another episode of the Self-Brain Surgery Podcast. We have an incredible guest for you today. I've got Dr. Michael Egnor. He's a fellow neurosurgeon. He practices at Stony Brook in New York. And Dr. Egnor, for years, has been writing about the difference between the mind and the brain and how modern neuroscience and the practice of neurosurgery has proven to him, and really to all of us, without any doubt, that mind and brain are not the same thing. We're going to have a deep talk today about Michael's new book, The Immortal Mind, a neurosurgeon's case for the existence of the soul. And we're going to go deep in the ideas of why mind and brain are not, in fact, the same thing, and why it matters. If you're looking for hope, if you've been through something hard, if you're trying to figure out if your life has meaning or purpose beyond the days that you'll be here, or why you can have reasonable hope if you've gone through something hard, or that you're dealing with something difficult in your life, why there's a reason to hope. Mike's going to get into that today. We're going to have a deep conversation about the mind and the brain and even the soul and some of these big ideas of why we're here in the first place. His book is amazing. We have some copies to give away, so be sure to stick around till the end of the interview to hear the instructions on how you might win one of the copies of Mike's book. It's a wonderful book. It'll be releasing tomorrow everywhere books are sold all across the world. There's an audio book. You can get it anywhere you can buy books, and it's a wonderful book called The Immortal Mind, a neurosurgeon's case for the existence of the soul with Dr. Michael Egnor. So let's have a talk with a fellow neurosurgeon who's going to help you change your mind about why this stuff all matters that we're talking about all the time here on the Self-Brain Surgery Podcast. Let's get after it. Welcome to the show, Michael.
Thank you, Lee. It's a real privilege to be here.
So grateful, especially to be having a conversation with another brain surgeon. I do a lot of interviews and talk to a lot of authors, but your book has really right up my alley, and I think is going to mean a lot to our listeners today. We got people from all over the world that'll listen to this show, and so it's an honor to have you here. And we're going to talk about some really light topics today, right? The mind and the brain and the soul, and these deep topics about what neuroscience has to say about who we really are, and if our brains are all that we are. Our listeners are familiar with this ground that we're going to cover today, but you bring a unique perspective, Mike. And before we get started, I think it would be appropriate if we just had a moment of prayer. If you would let's lead us in a little prayer, I think we'll get after it.
Yes, thank you. Lord Jesus, thank you so much for all the gifts you've given us, all the gifts you've given to Lee and I and to the wonderful people listening to this. Please bless us, and please open our minds and our hearts to your truth. In Jesus' name we pray.
Amen. Mike, you've written your first book, The Immortal Mind, a neurosurgeon's case for the existence of the soul. How'd you come to decide to write a book here in the middle of your neurosurgery career?
Yeah, it's a very long story. I'll try to summarize it in a comprehensible way. I started out my life as an atheist and as a materialist, and I never had any bad feelings towards Christianity. I just didn't think it was true. I thought Christians were nice people. I wasn't an angry atheist, but I just didn't think that it made any sense. And I loved science. I loved learning about the natural world. Majored in biochem in college. Fell in love with neuroscience and medical school, and decided that neurosurgery was the best way to explore the brain and the mind. I thought it'd be so cool to really get a firsthand sense of what that was all about. So I trained at the University of Miami. I graduated in 1991, went up to Stony Brook in Long Island, New York, and practiced there. I've been there ever since, and been on the faculty there. And I began noticing, as I saw a lot of patients, that what I was seeing clinically didn't really fit what I had learned in neuroscience. I had a little girl who was born missing at least half of her brain. She had basically half her head was just full of spinal fluid. And I told her family, I didn't think she would do too well. I didn't really have a lot of hope for her. As she grew up, she was perfectly normal. She's a bright, active, normal 25-year-old woman now. I have a bunch of other patients with kind of the same story. It doesn't mean that it's a good thing to be missing accessing a lot of your brain, but there's a lot of stuff out there I think that neurosurgeons see that that's not in the neuroscience textbooks. And I came to realize, reading these textbooks and knowing some neuroscientists who are great people, that they don't have a lot of contact with the brain. That is, that most neuroscientists have never seen a living human brain. None of them have ever operated on one. And neurosurgeons are in a remarkable position here, meaning that we see these patients in the clinic. We then expose their brains, we do our surgery, then we examine them postoperatively, we look at all their films, and you get a real strong intuitive sense of how the mind relates to the brain. So I got my intuitive sense was that the textbooks were really, really off base, that they were just laboratory stuff. This wasn't real world stuff that I was reading.
Right.
With some exceptions. There was some real world stuff in there, but it just didn't fit. So I began looking into the neuroscience literature. I began looking into philosophy because I realized that a lot of the problem with the way that neuroscience was looking at the brain and the mind wasn't so much scientific as it was conceptual, that they were holding to conceptions like the idea that the mind is entirely caused by the physical brain. That really is a philosophical idea. It's not a scientific idea per se,
That's right.
at least first. And so I read a lot of philosophy, I read a lot about philosophy of mind, and I read a lot of neuroscience. And that combined with my experience led me to really see things differently. And I began blogging for the Discovery Institute back about, it must be almost 15 years ago, and writing a lot on mind-brain stuff. And it got to the point where my colleague said, really you ought to put this together in a book because it's kind of a coherent and I think very interesting story. And I went through a religious conversion about 25 years ago, and I realized that what had blinded me to the reality of God and to the truth, not only about God, but about science and about the world and about myself, was atheism and materialism. And I want to convey to people, that's kind of my crusade right now, is to convey to people that materialism and atheism are lies. They're not true. At least philosophical mistakes, if not outright lies. And the real science and the real truth lies elsewhere. It lies in the Christian view of the world and the Christian view of human beings.
You've done a lot of work to unpack those ideas for yourself in your own life, and I want to make sure we don't skip over that. You have a kind of a dramatic story of your coming to know the Lord during a hospital encounter that you had. Why don't you tell us that story just so we understand how exactly you went from this atheist, materialist neuroscientist to a person who believed in God? That's a big leap. I was raised in the church, so it was kind of more natural for me, but you had a pretty dramatic encounter there. Why don't you tell us about that, Mike?
Sure. As I said, I never had any animus towards Christianity or towards God. I just thought it was a myth, and I just couldn't. I felt I'd had to leave my brain at the church door if I went inside.
Right.
So I began having what I call hauntings, which are these feelings that I would get when I was working or just by myself, or that I didn't know why I was alive, where I came from, where I was going, why there was anything. And it was a creepy feeling, but a fascinating feeling. The analogy was like if you wake up some morning in this huge mansion that you've never seen before, and you have no idea why you're there. You have no memory of where you came from. And you have to explain this. If you go about your daily life living in this mansion, never asking the fundamental question is, how did I end up here? Like, what's this all about? So I thought a lot about it, and I was thinking that maybe Christianity had some answers to that, but I was still a bit resistant. And my youngest child was born, a boy, and when he was a few months old, we noticed that he wasn't smiling. He wasn't making eye contact with us. So we took him to a pediatric neurologist, and we were afraid that he was autistic, and afraid that he. And the neurologist said he's kind of young. It's really hard to say. Let's give him some more time. As the months went by, he still wasn't really interacting with us, and so I was pretty scared. And autism really scared me. The idea that a child could be severely disconnected in a way that he didn't know me and so on was a very painful thing. So one night I was seeing a consult at an outside hospital. It was a Catholic hospital. And after I'd seen the patient, I just couldn't get this off my mind. So I went into the chapel of the hospital. And I knelt down in front of the altar, and I said, God, I don't know if you exist. This is a last-ditch effort because I got no other options. But the thought that my son wouldn't know me, that my child wouldn't have a connection to me, is too much to bear for me. It's not a burden I can handle. So if you exist, please take this off my shoulders. And I heard a voice, only time in my life I've ever heard a voice. It was inside my head, but it wasn't my voice. And the voice said, "But that's what you're doing to me." And I was overwhelmed. I basically collapsed on the floor. And I realized that God was showing me what he felt like when a child of his doesn't know him and doesn't connect to him. So I promised him I wouldn't do it to him anymore. And I asked him to heal my son. And a couple of days later was my son's 6th birthday party. And I get home from work, and he's a perfectly normal child. He's smiling and making contact, and he's now a young man in his 20s, and he's a very normal, happy, healthy guy. I promised God I would never be autistic to him anymore. So that kind of began my willingness to talk publicly about what I was seeing. I kind of felt that I had something I wanted to tell people, not only about my experience with God, but about the truth about the way the human soul interacts with the brain and the body. And so that's why I wrote the book.
Incredible. This story is just amazing. And it kind of became missional for you then just to share this insight with your life and in your work. So it's fascinating how God communicates with each of us in different ways. And I appreciate you being willing to share your faith like that. What do you think about the idea? Just before I say that, let me say this. For any listener who hasn't been listening for a while, if you're not familiar with some of the terms that Mike and I are going to talk about today, we talk about materialism. And materialism basically is this philosophical idea that everything can be explained by the workings of the material from which it's made. And particularly with neuroscience, the idea is that basically everything about you is the function of a neuron in your brain. And so every single thing about your life and your personality, and even the idea that you have a mind or a self, is really just the artifact of some electrical activity in a cell in your brain, right, Mike?
Yes. It's basically just the viewpoint that there's nothing spiritual in the world. The vast majority of materialists are also atheists. It's the viewpoint that God doesn't exist, that there's no afterlife, that we don't have souls, and that we are essentially we're really meat robots. That's most materialists would prefer we don't say it that way, but that's really what materialism is. That we're just robots made of meat.
That's right.
And that viewpoint of things goes back to Descartes, back in the 17th century, who was a philosopher who himself was not a materialist, but he said that human beings were a composite of an immaterial substance, the soul, and a body that was just a machine. And as a philosophical viewpoint, there are many good Christians who accept Descartes' kind of dualism, it's called. But what happened was, over the next few centuries, as materialists kind of came to dominate the scientific and philosophical world, and they took Descartes' idea that we're like a ghost in a machine, and they just got rid of the ghost. So the only thing that's left is the machine. If you deny that we have a soul, then we're just a machine, and we're just a biological machine. And then they're stuck with the idea of trying to explain how we have a mind when they were the ones who got rid of the mind. And so they get all these crazy theories about how the mind happens. And we end up in the mess we're in now in neuroscience, where neuroscientists really don't have a clue as to how mental things come out of the brain. But if one accepts a Christian worldview, particularly the worldview of Thomas Aquinas, I think, who is one of the great saints and philosophers in Christian history, it's much easier to understand how the mind and the brain relate, and that we have spiritual souls.
That's right. And if you accept the idea that we're just made of the stuff from which that our minds are just made up of the function of the cells that we're made of, what does that say about the purpose and meaning of our existence?
Yeah, well, it really drains it of purpose and meaning. If God doesn't exist and if we are meat robots, then of course there really isn't any meaning to our lives. We can try to fake it. We can pretend that there's meaning, but that's not real. And frankly, it's a terribly bleak way of looking at the world. I mean, the only pleasure you can have in the world is just pleasure you sort of create for yourself. It's a very, very depressing way of understanding life. And it's a lie, and it's not true.
Yeah, and you can say that with some authority, because when I said a while ago materialism is philosophical rather than scientific, that's because we say that because materialism can't be proved from a scientific standpoint. So you have to have some faith at some point that that's a correct worldview, because it's not a scientifically derived worldview, right?
Right. Materialism not only can't be proven, if you really believe in materialism, it's difficult to even believe in like having a rational process. Like, for example, the proposition that materialism is true is a proposition, and a proposition is not a material thing. A proposition is a mental thing. So even the very process of reasoning falls apart if you really take materialism seriously. So materialists have to keep violating their own basic metaphysical principles to even make their own arguments. So it's I think there are several perfectly valid or perfectly reasonable ways of looking at the world, different kinds of dualism. Idealism is another way, that everything is mental. I think that is a respectable way of looking at it. I don't think materialism is a respectable way of looking at the world. I think it's just a mistake. It's like saying that 2 + 2 = 5 is mathematics. It's not mathematics, it's just a mistake. And materialism is just a really bad idea.
I had a conversation on the podcast a couple of years ago with a neuroscientist named Sharon Diericks. I don't know if you know Sharon.
Oh, yeah, sure.
She wrote a great book called Am I Just My Brain? But she said her biggest problem with materialism is you can't live the worldview with any integrity, because the whole idea that our minds and our cells, if you think about it, is just an artifact of neuronal function, and that there's no real meaning and purpose in life, that eliminates the idea and possibility of free will. And so it's ridiculous to think that if your entire life and everything you do is programmed by your neurons, why would you have an argument with somebody about the validity of your worldview? Why would it matter?
Precisely. It's the free will thing is I think is a fascinating thing. It's fascinating not because there's any honest question as to whether we have free will. Of course we have free will. What is fascinating about it, it's a fascinating psychiatric thing. That is, that how does one live a life in which you deny free will, but you try to live as a normal human being. If you're denying free will, you're just lying to yourself. A good example of that is that there's a biologist named Jerry Coyne who has a book called Why Evolution is True, and I've debated him a lot online over the years about the issue of free will. And he put up a blog post a couple of years ago showing his car in a parking lot. Somebody had dented his fender and then drove off. And he was angry. He says, some guy dented my fender in the parking lot. So I wrote him that if free will isn't real, then the guy had no choice but to dent your fender. And you have every bit as much reason to blame the car as you do to blame the driver. So just the fact that you're outraged that somebody did something to you that was unethical means you must on some level believe in free will.
That's right.
So in fact, I mean, let's face it, first of all, what a person believes in is not just what they say. Belief is a totality of behavior.
That's right.
If you ask an embezzler if he believes in being financially honest and he says yes, you can say, well, you're lying because you're an embezzler. You don't really believe in being financially honest. So no one who denies free will, and there are a lot of scientists and a lot of materialists who do, no one who denies free will lives their life as if free will isn't real. So it's a charade. I see it more as kind of a materialist virtue signaling. That is, to deny free will publicly is to signal to other materialists that you are to be taken seriously. I follow the rules, but it's a pretense. It's a lie, and I'll believe that they really don't believe in free will when they start living their lives as if they and everyone around them are really meat robots with no freedom at all.
That's right. Well, let's talk about another definition here, just so it's clear for the listener. We talk about, in your words, in the book that you wrote, The Immortal Mind, you talk about the soul. And the Bible kind of conflates the three words, sort of mind, heart, soul. So just to make sure that the listener understands, let's define, is there a difference between mind and heart and soul, or are they all sort of the same idea?
It's fascinating. One is that I've read the Bible and various analyses of understanding of the soul that comes out of that. And there are, I think, several different perspectives on that. I'm Catholic, and the Catholic view, as I understand it, is that obviously we have souls. To kind of get into the details a little bit of the view, the Catholic view follows Thomas Aquinas rather closely. And A human being is a substance, and a substance is something that exists. We are a unified whole. We persist over time. We have agency. We can do things. We have attributes, but we're not attributes in other substances. It's kind of metaphysical jargon. And we are composed of both form and matter. Form is everything that's intelligible about what makes us alive, and matter is the actual matter of our body. And the form of us is our soul. And so our soul is not anything particularly mysterious or spooky. It's not like Casper the Ghost or something.
Yeah.
Our soul is simply the set of realities about us that make us alive. And you could say that what the soul is, if you want to know what your soul is in this perspective, if you say everything that is true about you right now, minus everything that will be true about you a minute after you die, that's your soul. So your soul is everything that makes you alive. The human soul and everything that's alive has a soul. So animals have souls, plants have souls, but we have different kinds of souls. Human souls have powers of sensation, powers of locomotion, powers of emotion, memory, but we also have a power of reason, and we have a power of free will, which other living things don't have. And there's another fascinating and important thing about the human soul, is that the human soul is also a spirit. That is, that our soul is the only soul in the natural world that is a spiritual soul. And it's that way that we are created in God's image, because God is a spirit, and a spirit has several qualities. A spirit is something that knows, something that loves, something that has agency and can take action. It's something that persists. It doesn't change every second. It's something that is inherently eternal. That is, that a spirit can't die. And it is the spiritual nature of our soul that is the way that we are created in God's image. God put just a tiny, tiny bit of his spiritual self into us. And that's the way I understand the soul. The soul is what makes us alive, and it's a spiritual entity created by God.
Yeah, love it. It's dawned on me a second ago. I'll just say this parenthetically. When we were talking about free will, I just remembered you wrote, I think, probably the best essay I've ever read on free will. There's a book that the Discovery Institute put out, The Comprehensive Guide to Science and Faith. Did you write that chapter about free will?
Yes.
Yeah, so I didn't put that together, that we have this the same Mike Egnor that wrote that. So good job on that. So that's another book. I'll put that in the show notes. Another wonderful guide, another resource that the listener will want to check out. So let's talk then for a second about sort of different ways that you've come to see how mind and brain and soul are not the same thing. And we'll talk about, in the context of that, as you mentioned earlier briefly, people that don't have a normal brain but still have a normal life. And then people who have undergone epilepsy surgery, and we'll talk about Wilder Penfield. You can tell us some of the stories about Dr. Penfield. And then some of the modern neuroscience findings that you think sort of illustrate this idea. So maybe just unpack a little bit about your book and some of the stories, and we'll talk about those things.
Sure. As I mentioned earlier, I have quite a few patients. I'm sure you've seen the same thing.
Yeah.
I think neurosurgeons encounter this with missing parts of their brains who are really in pretty good shape. Obviously, there are parts of your brain that you can't do without. You can't do without your motor area, your speech area, your brain stem. There are parts that are very, very intolerant of injury. But there are other parts that really you can do just fine without. And that always struck me as bizarre, and that wasn't what was in my neuroscience textbooks.
That's right.
And what really kind of brought it to a head was I was doing an awake brain operation many years ago. I don't do a lot of them. It's not my specialty within neurosurgery, but I was doing it on a woman who had a left frontal lobe astrocytoma, which was low grade, but it was infiltrating a lot of her left frontal lobe. And I wanted to make sure I protected her speech area. Right. So I did an awake procedure. You can do brain surgery awake, of course, with local anesthesia so people don't feel pain. And I'm mapping her frontal lobe by stimulating her brain and finding out where her speech area is so I can protect it as I remove the tumor. And I'm taking out a substantial portion of the frontal lobe to get the tumor out. And I'm talking to her. I'm having a conversation with her. And it's a perfectly normal conversation. We're talking about the weather, talking about her family, talking about the cafeteria food in the hospital. And it goes on for several hours as we're taking out the tumor. And at the end of the case, and she did very well, she did nicely, made a good recovery. And at the end of the case, I was flabbergasted. I'm thinking, here I am taking out a major part of this lady's brain. I might as well have been cutting her hair. I mean, she showed no response, but none of my textbooks explained that. that you could do that. All the textbooks had all these circuits that did so on. But so clearly there was something different about the mind-brain relationship than what was in the textbooks. So I began looking at the neuroscience of it. And I came across the work of Wilder Penfield. And Penfield was a pioneering neurosurgeon in epilepsy surgery, particularly in the mid-20th century. And he did about 1,100 awake brain operations of the sort that I just described. And he really is responsible for much of the mapping of the cerebral cortex that's been done. And Penfield was fascinated by epilepsy, and he was fascinated by the results that he obtained when he would stimulate the brain. And he wrote a book called Mystery of the Mind, where he described his own personal journey on that. And he, just like me, had started out as a materialist, but he changed. And by the end of his career, he was a convinced dualist. And what he said was that when he would stimulate the brain, he could get 4 different kinds of responses out of stimulating the brain. He could get movement. Stimulating the motor area would make a patient's limb move. He could get a sensation. The patient would have a tingling or a flash of light or something like that. He could get emotion. If you stimulate certain parts of the brain, a person can have a strong emotion. And he could get memories, particularly the temporal lobe. People would have memories. He said, but he could never get what he called mind action. And what he meant by mind action, I think, is any kind of abstract thought. That is, that you could stimulate the brain, but people would never, when he stimulated the brain, have a thought about God. They would never have a thought about mathematics or logic or reason. Any of the higher thoughts, the stuff we're doing right now, you can't stimulate in the brain. And I calculated just on the back of an envelope how many stimulations he did. He did at least hundreds of thousands on those patients. If you imagine operation takes 8 hours, you do 1 stimulation a minute, 1,100 patients, that's about 500,000 stimulations. Not a single one of his stimulations evoked any kind of abstract thought at all. And he came to the conclusion, he said, that the most obvious, parsimonious conclusion there is that abstract thought isn't generated by the brain. The brain may be permissive for it. That is, the normal brain function is probably necessary to think about mathematics, etc., but not sufficient. That there's a part of the mind that's not from the brain. It makes sense. He also noticed that if you look at the phenomenology of seizures, when people have seizures, sometimes people remain awake during seizures, partial complex seizures. And people do all sorts of things. People sometimes will have tingling, or they'll have movement of a limb. They can have an emotion. They can drive cars. There are people who operate cars when they're having a partial complex seizure. But people never do mathematics. There are no calculus seizures where you have a seizure and you take first derivatives, or where you do long division. There are no logic seizures where you compulsively have to do logic. And Penfield asked the same question. He said, why are there no mind seizures? And so there's this whole category of thought that cannot be evoked from the human brain. And the obvious explanation for that is that it doesn't come from the human brain. And so that fascinated me. I think that's one of the great moments in neuroscience. And I've discussed that with leading neuroscientists, and they tend to dismiss it. They kind of say, that was 100 years ago, blah. But it's still the best work that has ever been done with stimulating the brain and looking at responses. No one has come close in terms of the detail and the volume. And the materialist neuroscientists simply overlook the evidence. The other fascinating science that has been done on this has been with split brain surgery.
Right.
There are kinds of seizures that people have that spread from one hemisphere of the brain to the other, that if they remain localized in one hemisphere, really are fairly mild seizures. But when they spread across the corpus callosum, which is a big bundle of fibers between the hemispheres, can be major seizures. And it was discovered back in the late 30s and early 40s that you could operate on people who were having these kinds of seizures that were not being treated adequately with medication. And by cutting the corpus callosum, you could stop the bad seizures from happening. And curiously, the people who have their corpus callosum cut are perfectly normal people after it's cut for everyday life. Patients with a corpus callosotomy, you can't tell the difference. And they feel normal, even though their hemispheres are essentially completely separated. There are tiny connections that remain, tiny subcortical connections that represent maybe 1/10,000th of the number of axons that were cut in the corpus callosum, but that's minimal. So there's a guy named Roger Sperry who did research on learning about how the brain works when the corpus callosum has been cut. And he found that when you do very careful studies, there are perceptual disabilities that these people have, that they can't transfer images from one hemisphere to the other, that they can't transfer words from one hemisphere to the other. But interestingly, and many researchers have followed up on this, you can easily integrate concepts That is, that you can see, for example, there's a researcher named Alice Cronin at MIT who did wonderful work on this in the 90s. And she would show to one brain hemisphere in a patient who had had split brain surgery, for example, a picture of a violin. And to the other hemisphere, she would show three pictures. One would be of an artist's palette, one would be of a toilet plunger, and one would be of a stethoscope. And she would ask, match the one picture of the violin to the appropriate other picture. And almost all the patients would match the violin to the artist's palette because both were forms of art. That's music and painting. But no part of the patient's brain had seen both the violin and the palette. So how could the person match them?
Right.
No part of their brain saw both. So the way they matched them was by the concept of art. And the concept of art wasn't split by the surgeon's knife. They couldn't match the pictures. They couldn't bring one picture from one hemisphere to the other. They couldn't even bring the words from one hemisphere to the other, but they could bring the understanding without any difficulty at all between the hemispheres. What that implies is that the intellectual ability, the sort of the spiritual ability to understand what art means is not split by the knife. That is, that we have a part of our mind that is not in our brain. So there's a lot of beautiful, fascinating research like that. There's other research that's been done on twins who are joined at the brain. That's a very rare thing, but there are some children born who are joined at the head, and their brains are connected. There's a pair of twins in Canada named Krista and Tatiana Hogan, who've been studied in some depth with this. And these are little girls who share what's called a thalamic bridge, which is a piece of brain tissue that connects the deepest parts of their brains. And these kids can see through each other's eyes. They can feel each other's skin. Like if one girl closes her eyes, she can identify objects shown to the other girl's visual field.
Wow.
The girl's mother, if she touches the leg of one girl, the other girl knows that the leg has been touched. They also have unified control of several of their limbs. But what they don't have is they don't have the same personalities. They're completely separate people. They have different likes and dislikes. They have different emotions. They're two completely different people. They have fights. They get angry at one another. They like different things. In school, one kid can't study one subject. The other kids study the other subject and both pass the test. They both have to do independently. And this again shows that there's a part of their mind that is not connected in their brain that they can't pass across. That's the spiritual nature of their soul. So they have two spiritual souls. So the brain and the mind are different things. There are some things in the mind that do come from the brain, specifically the ability to move, the ability to have sensations, the ability to have memories, and the ability to have emotions. But there are things in the mind that don't come from the brain, and that's the intellect and will. The intellect is what we have for concepts, for reason, for judgment, things like that. And the will is the free will. And those aren't in the brain. They're not material. They're spiritual.
That's right. One of my favorite parts of the book, the way you unpack, is the way that you unpack the modern neuroscience findings and research in people with persistent vegetative state or long-term altered levels of consciousness. Maybe just briefly touch on some of the things we've learned from functional MRI research about what's going on inside of people whose brains appear to be offline, for lack of a better word.
It's absolutely fascinating. There is a condition, as you well know, called persistent vegetative state. It is considered to be the deepest level of unawareness, just barely better than being brain dead. And it can be people who've had bad brain injuries, people who've had massive strokes or hypoxia. And it is commonly a permanent thing, not always, fortunately, but commonly. And the people show sleep-wake cycles, but it's always been assumed that there was nothing going on inside them mentally. And that's why they call it vegetative, that they were just a shell.
The lights are on, but nobody's home.
Nobody's home. And of course, nurses who work in ICUs and neurosurgeons who pay attention to their patients have always known that that's not really true. That is, that when you're around patients like that, you have to watch what you say, because if you say things that are upsetting, their heart rate goes up, so on, things happen. But the official medical teaching was that there was no one home. There was no mind. There's a researcher named Adrian Owen who worked at Cambridge in England about 20 years ago, who did a fascinating study where he took a young woman who was in persistent vegetative state, very convincingly diagnosed of it. A bunch of experts examined her, put her in, and her brain was almost destroyed. I think she had been in a car accident. And he put her in an MRI machine and did a functional MRI image of her brain. Functional MRI imaging is a way of imaging the brain that looks at blood flow in regions of the brain that seems to correlate to some extent with brain activity or what you're thinking and what you're doing. You see these patterns of the brain light up, and we use it clinically sometimes to kind of guide surgery. It's a wonderful experimental method. You have to be a little careful with it because interpreting it can be very subtle. It's kind of difficult to interpret. But so he did functional MRI imaging of what was left of her brain, which wasn't much. And he asked her, he put headphones on her in the MRI machine, and he asked her, imagine that you're playing tennis, or imagine that you're walking across a room. He asked her to think about things. And he noticed that her brain was lighting up in certain areas, which was kind of interesting given that she was supposed to be completely unaware of anything. Right. But she responds to questions. She didn't move, but her brain she was seeing activity there. So he took normal people who were not in persistent vegetative state and asked them the same questions in the MRI machine, and their brains did the same thing, really. It was identical to hers. So, but he had a question, it's a fascinating question. He said, well, maybe her brain is lighting up not because she understands, but just because of the noise, like she's hearing these sounds, maybe it's just an unconscious reflex. So he put her back in the MRI machine, and he asked the same questions, but he scrambled the words. So instead of saying, imagine you're walking across a room, he would say, room, walking, imagine across your, walking your. So it didn't make any sense. And as soon as it made no sense, her brain didn't light up. Wow. So she only responded to things that made sense. So he said, clearly she knows what he's talking about. So other people have followed up with this research, and now it's presumed, I think it's about 40% of people in persistent vegetative state, evidence of comprehension of what's going on around them at a fairly high level using functional MRI imaging. People are also using EEG to look at this. And there are people who will answer questions. You can work out a code where the way their brain lights up tells like a yes or no answer. Right. There are people who will describe facts about their lives, about their family. I believe there are people who can even do simple mathematics in persistent vegetative state. So what this shows us is, I think, is that there is a disconnect between the way the brain works and the way the mind works. If the brain worked the same as the mind, and all the mind came from the brain, when the brain is nearly completely destroyed, the mind would be essentially destroyed as well. Exactly. But that's not true. Yeah. People can still have mind function that is at a fairly high level, even with massive brain damage, which again backs up what I think is the scientific observation that we have spiritual souls, that our brain is obviously very important in terms of our mind, but it's not the whole story. There's more to us than that.
Just as we kind of start to think about landing this plane today, Mike, I have a couple other things I want to talk to you about. But for the person who's listening out there somewhere that's, say, going through something hard in their life, they've lost somebody, or a lot of our listeners will be like me, somebody who lost a child or somebody who's going through something hard.
I'm so sorry. I lost a child too.
I'm so sorry. Yeah, but a lot of the listeners that find my work do so because they've read my books where I've talked about that. And so there may be somebody out there who's listening and saying, why does this stuff matter? Like, how does it help me find hope to know that my mind and my brain aren't the same thing? Why does it matter?
That's a great question. And it's a question I think is really at the heart of what I'm doing. It's the heart of what you're doing, is pointing out that the scientific truth that we see is something that is not just an academic exercise. All right, this is not something to just do in the musty halls of universities. This matters in people's lives. It matters enormously. And it's given me enormous comfort. As you mentioned, the loss of a loved one can really be a devastating event. Yeah. And what helps me is the understanding, and I think this is absolutely true, that we have immortal souls, that when we die, our souls don't cease to exist.
That's right.
I believe that the Christian way of understanding eternity, of understanding our future, is true. So I know that my son, who passed away a few years ago, is in heaven, and we will meet again, and we will spend eternity together. And it is unbelievably reassuring. Meaning, it doesn't take all the pain away. There's still pain there. But I know that death is not permanent. Death is a transition from this earthly life to a life with God, to a life where you go back to the source of love, to the source of beauty and holiness. And the way I think of life personally is that we're kind of like babies in a womb, that we live in this little sheltered world.
Yep.
Birth is a very difficult process for a little baby. Just had my first grandson born about 2 weeks ago.
Congratulations.
Thank you, thank you. So, and I think death is a birth. And in fact, in the Catholic faith, the saints' days, we call them their birthdays in heaven. It's the days that they died.
That's right.
So it's their birthday in heaven.
That's right.
And the idea that the soul is eternal is not only what we learn from Christian theology, it is the best neuroscience supports that. The observations of Penfield and the observations of the researchers for split brain surgery and people who studied conjoined twins and people who studied persistent vegetative state, all that points to the existence of a spiritual soul. And a spiritual thing can't die the way a body dies.
That's right.
Because spirits are not made of matter and they can't disintegrate. They can't dissolve like a body dissolves. So also, of course, and this is a whole big topic, near-death experiences, which I think are very real things. And I'm happy to talk about them. There's one that Pam Reynolds was a patient of Dr. Robert Spetzler's at the Barrow Institute in Phoenix, is a fantastic story. Near-death experiences, I think, are very powerful evidence for survival of the soul after death. So this stuff really matters. It's not just academic. It matters for our understanding of eternity.
It does. And I'll remind the listener, we had John Burke on the show who wrote a whole book. He's written 2 books now, Imagine the God of Heaven and Imagine Heaven, talking about his extensive research, near-death experiences. And I think that another arm of this whole conversation, it kind of illustrates the difference that the mind doesn't die when the body does, when the brain does. And that's a good
Absolutely.
reason why we have hope. I agree with you completely. One more. Go ahead.
We have hope and we have responsibility. And
That's
this is one thing that's in my own Christian life I've realized is that everything we do in this life has eternal ramifications.
That's right.
That how we treat people, our integrity, how we serve the Lord, how we serve our neighbors, this matters forever.
That's right.
What you've done does not go away when you die. So it's important to make what you do as loving and generous and good as you can to honor the Lord. Amen. Because it's forever.
That's right. That's right. We have a purpose and a meaning to our life, which is the opposite of the idea of the materialist. Like everything that you do in your life matters, and it matters on an eternal scale. And it even affects what we know now with epigenetics. Like we know now that the way we live our lives and the way we use our minds affects how other people even activate their genes. It may affect our offspring.
Absolutely.
And how they process stress and all those things. It's super important. And so I thank you, Mike, for writing the book and for bringing this really great comprehensive look at mind brain. Tremendous work that you've done. And I'm excited to be releasing this episode on the week that your book is available in the world. It's coming out Tuesday, the 4th. Is that right?
The 3rd, actually.
The 3rd. Yeah, Tuesday, the 3rd of June. Everywhere books are sold. And is there an audiobook available too?
Yes. There's an audiobook, and it's also available on Kindle. And I should say I love your work as well.
Thank you.
And I have learned a great deal from it, and it's very special to me too. So thank you
so much. And where can people learn more about you?
I blog for the Discovery Institute, which is a wonderful organization.
Yeah.
Discovery Institute is devoted to the truth about evolution, the truth about where we come from, and about how life came to be. And there's a related institute called the Mind Matters News is the public voice of it, and so you can find us blogging at Mind Matters News, or Evolution News and Views is the Discovery Institute's blog.
Wonderful. I wish we had more time, and maybe if Lord wills, and if you're willing, we have you back another time after the book launch settles down. I'd love to talk to you more.
I would love to. I'd love to, Lee. Thank you.
Because I wanted to get into Benjamin Libet's research and a lot of the other things that you've written extensively about.
Sure.
We'll have another conversation another day, but I have one more very superficial, easy question for you, Mike. This is a softball. If mind and brain are not the same thing, and we both believe that they are not the same thing, that implies that mind has a role in possibly with how we communicate with God and how prayer works and all those things. And at some point, though, if we think about physics, there has to be something that happens that converts a mental process into a physical process in the brain. Have you done any research or looked at that? Like, how does the things you think about turn into stuff that your brain does?
That's absolutely fascinating, and that's in some sense where the rubber hits the road.
Softball question, like I said.
Yeah, I'm thinking. I was kind of expecting a question like, "What flavor ice cream do you like?" And I was thinking, well, that's gonna be easy, A fascinating question. I think there are two approaches to answering it, both of which are absolutely intriguing, and that if I had time, I'd like to spend the rest of my life studying them. One is with quantum mechanics. And there is a phenomenon in quantum mechanics when you look at subatomic particles. If you're not measuring them, if you're not looking at them, it is very well established, scientifically it's been established for 100 years, that they exist in what's called a state of superposition, where there are probabilities of different states, like different locations, different momentum, different energies, all that stuff. When you look at it and measure it, the subatomic particle assumes one of those properties.
The observer effect, yeah.
The observer effect. And that is a link, if you think about it, between mind and matter. That observing matter changes it. So mind can change matter. And a number of philosophers and scientists, including Roger Penrose, who's a pioneering Nobel laureate physicist, have theorized that the way the mind interacts with the brain is at the quantum level. And that is kind of it's a result of the observer effect. Another way of looking at it, which I think is related to this, is actually ancient. It comes from Aristotle. Aristotle said that there are, when you want to understand a phenomenon, you have to understand 4 causes of it. One cause is its material cause, is the matter that's involved with it. The other cause is its efficient cause, which is sort of the thing that pushes it, like with billiard balls. The efficient cause is one billiard ball hitting another billiard ball. Another cause is the formal cause. That is the intelligible principle that makes it what it is. And the other cause is the final cause, that is the purpose for this happening. And you really only understand a process well when you understand all 4. When we think about how mind would affect brain, what we usually do, if we're not thinking deeply about it, is we only think about the material and the efficient cause. That we think about the brain matter, and we think about electrons bumping into things. But there's also formal cause and final cause. That is, there's the act of intelligence itself on the brain, and there's the act of purposes on the brain. And many people who get into this philosophy have pointed out that the intellect, the capacity for reason, is kind of a formal cause that can change the brain. And free will is a final cause, a purpose that can change the brain. So you can integrate mind and brain using Aristotelian metaphysics, and you can also integrate it using quantum mechanics. And in fact, on a very deep level, they may both agree. So that's the softball answer to the softball question.
I love it. And I think that'll get into, if we do have another conversation down the road about Lebet's work, I think quantum physics probably explains the action potential business that Lebet saw.
Yeah,
sort of
absolutely.
Collapsing. The only possible thing that could happen is the wave that collapsed and made it happen that way. So anyway, the listeners are actually familiar a little bit with those ideas. So they'll understand and resonate with what you just said. And I have an announcement, an exciting announcement. We have 3 copies of your book to give away to listeners. So friend, if you find yourself saying, I got to read this guy's book, and you want a copy of The Immortal Mind by Dr. Egnor, please write in to contact@drleewarren.com. Make sure we have your name, your mailing address, and your zip code. And it has to be a U.S. address only. And we're going to give you a chance to win one of those 3 copies. So excited to have a chance to share your book, Mike. We're praying for the success of your message. I'm grateful for your time today and your friendship.
I thank you so much, Lee. It's been a real privilege and a pleasure to meet you and be here. Thank you.
God bless you, my friend.
God bless you as well.
What an incredible talk. I could probably talk to Mike all day. He was fascinating. I'm sure we'll have him back another time on the show. But I hope you were able to sort out why I'm always telling you that it's so important to understand that you're not just the activity of the neurons inside your skull. There's more to you than that, friend. Your mind is going to live for eternity. And it matters that you understand that, because as soon as you understand that mind and brain are not the same thing, that's how you can begin to take charge of these processes that allow you to change your brain into something that works for you instead of something that works against you. No matter what the world may tell you, no matter what you may hear in school or from Instagram or from the people on the media, you might have this constant stream of information that you're stuck with the brain that you have, or that traumas and dramas and tragedies and other things that happen in your life can make you a particular way and you don't have much choice about it, or that the family you grew up in or the genetics you inherited may determine how your life is going to play out. But the fact is, your brain can change if you're willing to change what you think about. You can do self-brain surgery, and you can overcome just about anything. You can become more resilient. You become more hopeful. You can become a person who isn't a slave to the way things have always been. But to do that, you've got to understand that there's a real case to be made from science, from physics, from faith, that the mind and the brain are not the same thing. There's more to you than the activity of the cells inside your skull. Hope you enjoyed this conversation with Mike Egnor. His book is available tomorrow everywhere books are sold. The Immortal Mind, a Neurosurgeon's Case for the Existence of the Soul. I'm so grateful for the time that Dr. Egnor spent with us today. And boy, we've got some great shows coming up, friend. If you want some incredible conversations, stick around, because next week we got Dr. James Tour, who's a world-famous synthetic chemist, that's coming up on the show. And every Friday in June, I'm going to give you a Just Me June episode. We're going to have solo episodes where we're going to go into the whole program about why it matters so much that you understand that you are uniquely, fearfully, and wonderfully made, that you have the tools inside you to overcome just about anything that you go through, that you're not stuck with the way things have been or the way your parents told you had to be or the way things have always been in your family. You're not even stuck with the way you were yesterday, because you're already different than you were when you started hearing this conversation. So we got some wonderful, wonderful conversations with experts, authors, people with great stories coming up in June. We also have 4 episodes coming up with just me, where you and I are going to go deep on the neuroscience and what the Bible has to say about all these things, and why I'm always telling you, you can't change your life until you change your mind. I'm Dr. Lee Warren. I'm so grateful for your time today, friend. Be sure and subscribe to the show wherever you listen or watch on YouTube. Make sure you hit that subscribe button and the little bell icon to be sure you get notified when there's new episodes. We're doing a great amount of work on our YouTube channel. Lauren, our assistant, is doing these wonderful short clips of all these conversations that we've had. And you can watch those just like you scroll on Instagram. You can watch all those shorts and see fascinating highlights from episodes that have been going on for years around here. And we're just now finally getting them onto video so you can see them and enjoy them all over again. So be sure and subscribe wherever you listen. Make sure you follow us on YouTube. And if you're not getting my newsletter, please subscribe to the Self-Brain Surgery newsletter every Sunday. Since 2014, I've been bringing you my best prescriptions for how you can change your mind and change your life starting today. That's what I always say. Now, if you haven't been around very long, you may wonder why I'm always saying, hey, start today. I'll tell you why. Dr. Egnor and I both talked in this episode about how we have both lost sons. And you're going to go through some hard things in your life, friend. There's going to be some stuff that comes along that knocks you off your feet. And every time you go through something like that, every time you lose a child like I have, or go through a divorce, or go to war and come home with PTSD, or something happens in your life that sweeps the rug out from under you, you're going to ask yourself a bunch of why and what now questions. You're going to say, I wish I had done this, or if only I had done that, or you're going to have all these thoughts that almost demand that you spend some time in the past inside your mind, wondering what could have been different. And the bottom line is, nothing can be different. Because the only thing you have a chance to do is change how you live from this moment forward. And that's why neuroplasticity and neuroscience is so exciting. And it's such a gift from God that we can change the way our brains work. We're not stuck with how things have been. But guess what? Once you know that, like Mike Egnor said on this episode, once you understand that you can change the way your brain interacts with your mind, it becomes a responsibility. And now you know that your life in the future can be different than it has been in the past. That's why I say, start today. I always say it. You can't change your life until you change your mind. The good news is you can start today. God bless you, friend. We'll see you next time. Thank you so much for being with us today. I'm Dr. Lee Warren, your host, and this has been another episode of the Self-Brain Surgery podcast, where we smash neuroscience and faith together to radically transform our lives. Please be sure and subscribe to the podcast wherever you listen. Share it with a friend, and make sure you sign up for my newsletter, drleewarren.substack.com, drleewarren.substack.com. Every Sunday since 2014, I've been bringing you my best prescriptions for how you can change your mind and change your life. The power of faith and neuroscience working together. Listen, friend, you can't change your life until you change your mind. And the good news is you can start today. I'm Dr. Lee Warren. We'll see you next time. God bless you.